Today we're talking about what you can do to bring more joy into your life, not just fleeting moments of happiness, but lasting inner joy. Hello and welcome back to the Spiritual Freedom Show with Richard Lawrence. My name is Darren Bull and this is the podcast helping you to awaken your chakras, unlock your psychic powers, and discover true spirituality. Now, by the end of this episode, you'll learn a key that you can use to create lasting inner joy in your life. You'll also learn what world-famous psychologist Daniel Kahneman had to say about what he called lasting satisfaction, something much more akin to joy than the fleeting experience of happiness. And you'll also get the example right at the end of someone who explained it so simply, but not just explained it, lived it, and in doing so changed the course of history around the world. Now, if you haven't subscribed yet, be sure to hit that bell so you don't miss any future conversations between Richard and myself about true spirituality. Richard.
Darren.
So today we are talking about simple secret of spiritual happiness. And I think I'd like to set the stage here with a quote from Dr. King.
Sure.
Because I think he made a lovely comparison between happiness and what he calls joy. And I think what it immediately reveals is that these are actually two different things. And I'd love to explore that with you today. And explore importantly what people can do to bring more lasting inner joy into their life. So these are the words of Dr. King I'd like to share. He says, "What is happiness? Happiness is laughter of the mind and that only. But joy is laughter of the soul, and it's a lasting thing. One can be joyful and compassionate and sad at the same time, but one cannot be happy and compassionate and sad at one and the same time. It's no figment of reality is happiness. It's just a transient thing." I think there's a lovely distinction there that he makes in passing for us what those two different things are. Because I think when people look in their own experience in life, you can see the difference,
Yes.
what you might feel. I mean, when we think of happiness, in the conventional sense anyway, it's this momentary experience that we feel spontaneously, and then it's a fleeting thing. But the lasting inner joy, that's something completely different.
Yes, I think it's actually a very deep statement he's made there, and he's making this distinction. He's using those words.
Sure.
So some people will see happiness and some people will talk about happiness in a more spiritual context and they might mean something different. Sure. But he here, I think, is referring to happiness purely as in the material sense of really satisfying desires, really. Yeah. Things that people want, they get them, they enjoy it, and they're happy when it happens, and then it ends, and then it's over. Yeah. One thing I think is very important to know about spiritual happiness and real joy, and there are gradations of it. You can move from happiness to joy to bliss.
True.
And there's one thing in there which goes with spiritual happiness, which is peace, inner peace. Now, you may not be in a peaceful state. You might be in a very active state. You might be helping people in an extremely active and demanding way. And I think that's why this statement is so deep, because he says you can have joy and compassion and sadness at the same time.
True. That's a major point.
Yeah, and I would say this too. You could feel tremendous guilt. And this is from experience, so I'm not going to tell people what that guilt was about. Yeah. But you can feel guilt, and we should all feel guilt. You can, I've found since certain meditative experiences I've had, many memories come back to me, some of them really tiny ones, which I hadn't thought about for decades. For example, I suddenly remembered being unkind to a boy at his 10th birthday party very recently. I've never thought about that since. And I was 10 and, I felt a frisson of guilt now. I didn't harm him actually, but, I wasn't as kind as I should have been on his birthday. Things like that. But it isn't about his birthday, or the event. That's just a memory that triggered something in me. And then you could have much more serious levels of things you should have done, you haven't done, or whatever it might be. But in the midst of that, allowing your conscience to speak, strange as it may seem, can come a great peace at the same time. So you can feel both this guilt, not guilt, which is put upon you. I don't mean conditioned guilt that is bred into you wrongly by sort of misguided people. I don't mean that. I mean genuine from your own conscience.
Yeah.
You feel that, and in the process of feeling it, you feel a tremendous deep state of peace. And that's why I can see what Dr. King means there when he says compassion and sadness and joy. Now, most of us are programmed to think that happiness comes from things we do. From being active, it's exhilarating, it's stimulating. Sure. I'm out dancing somewhere, I'm here, I'm happy. It's not necessarily wrong, so let's make that clear. It just isn't the deep, lasting joy you can get. But what people don't realize, you can be in an apparently more passive state, a more static state, a great state of peace, and this can kind of merge into deep joy and bliss, and sometimes it lasts for hours. And in fact, I remember the first time I experienced that, I was worried. I was actually disturbed in the midst of this tremendous peace. Part of me was saying, gosh, what if this never ends? Well, I won't be able to function tomorrow. Yeah. And it was just filling me for hours, and I went to bed with it, and I thought, these are, if you like, lower thoughts, but they were like, this is wrong. I've learned, you go with it, and actually, here's something that's important to remember I think for everybody. One of the ways not to find true happiness or spiritual happiness is to expect to be happy all the time.
This is a good point for people.
Or to expect, and this is controversial, to be enlightened all the time.
Oh, people don't expect that.
No. If you've entered a state of enlightenment, I'd learned this from Dr. King. But even if you look at some of the Zen teachers and some of the yogis, they thought they should walk around always in that state, permanently. And it put a tremendous strain on them. There's a wonderful line in a prayer called the New Lord's Prayer, delivered by Jesus. And he refers to, there's a statement in it, when you say this prayer, say, never again will I turn from my inner vision of you. And Dr. King said, if you really did that, you'd be immobile, you couldn't move, because if you really were never turning from your inner vision, you'd be in a deep state of samadhi, you couldn't do anything. Of course, in there is a lesson, but of course the Master Jesus is saying you can keep that inner vision even in your active life, but you aren't in that state.
True. Yeah.
And likewise with the pursuit of joy. If you walk around thinking, you start thinking, what's wrong with me? I should be happy, and people then pretend to be happy. I don't just mean pretend to others, which is quite dangerous. They pretend to themselves. They're trying to convince themselves they're happy. No, don't expect that. What it is, though, it's lasting.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily a result of a particular activity. Whereas people think, well, if I go to this theatre, or if whatever it is, have a wonderful meal, sure, that's going to give me the happiness I want. They're not thinking it in that way, but that's what's going on, really. If I save up for those clothes, whatever it might be. Now, I'm not saying it won't give you some happiness, but it's temporary. It will come and it will go and it will fade. The kind of spiritual happiness that Dr. King is referring to is lasting, and although you will leave it, and you should leave it, anyone who is constantly at peace and constantly happy is not a spiritual person. That's a very, maybe sounds dogmatic, but it must be true. If you are aware of the conditions in this world,
that's a great point.
You shouldn't be. Or even if you hear bad news of a personal nature about friends or family or whoever, you can't walk around saying you're happy all the time, or even pretending to yourself that you should be. But the kind of happiness is like a reservoir that I'm talking about. Yeah. It's like a lake that stays peaceful, and it's got deep, deep pool of joy within that lake, and you can tap it. It's there, and you might leave it, but the lake's still there, and that's the difference.
Yeah, I love this image you've given of this reservoir that you can tap into. And it was interesting. I was reading a study about happiness. There's a lot of it around nowadays, particularly one particular person who passed away recently, but Daniel Kahneman. He explored happiness a lot.
Right.
And what he was saying, which I kind of take in a spiritual sense based on what you've just said, is that there is this fleeting kind of happiness that people can find through things and maybe through the company of people and whatnot, but it's not the lasting satisfaction, he calls it. Maybe we'll call it something deeper than that, fulfillment or even more, that actually is what really satisfies people. Something deeper, something where they're working towards long-term goals that eventually help them to build a life that they can be proud of, or that they think is valuable. So meaningful activities to them, whatever that is. And if I would think about that in a spiritual context, it's things that you're working in a meaningful way for you, not for you, but I mean, what's meaningful to you in terms of, it might be working for others, especially, in a spiritual sense, if you're expressing that love and the concern you have for the world around you, that's coming out in a myriad of different ways that you're trying to improve the world around you, and you find that meaningful. There's a lasting satisfaction and inner joy that can come from that. I think that's just a glimpse into the more profound point that you're making about the real experience of inner spiritual joy and ultimately bliss that one can have. Yeah, and I think just begins to point to service as a key element in our lives.
Totally, that is the key element, and there's nothing better. That's why I come back to this statement he makes: you can be compassionate and joyful and sad at the same time. You might be working in an emergency ward, and who's going to be seeing terrible things? It's going to make you sad. It's going to make you very sorry to see the state some people come into, and yet the work you're doing, because you can actually save that person's life, gives you a great inner joy at the same time.
Exactly.
Just that's a very active example. And it's not dependent either, I would say, on endorsements from anybody else. It's nice to get them, and they should be given to people who are doing these things, but the world doesn't recognize all of the great things that are achieved by some people in the day that they're achieved. They recognize them much later, usually. They might even kill a person for some of the things they're doing, which are actually good. We can think of examples of that. So they might get shot while campaigning for a good thing, and that is this world. So you might get endorsements. Your own family and friends may or may not even believe in what you're doing or think you should be doing it. It's not dependent on that. It's dependent on what you said, that for you, this is what you're meant to do to serve others, and there is nothing as joyful as that. There is nothing, actually. Not even the inner states come, and they will come, and actually serving others will tend to lead them to come, because you're burning up karma. You're burning up your own impurities through service. You might have an experience that you need in a particular life. You might have robbed a bank in a past life, and in this life you're going to get robbed, just to learn how it feels to be robbed, so you'll never want to do it again. It's not a punishment. It's going to come back to you. But instead of that, you engage in service. And in your service, you're giving money to others. You're helping other people. And through this, you're learning the lessons. And actually, in the end, you won't need to be robbed, because you've learnt the lesson. That's how the manipulation of karma may have worked.
Interesting.
But at the same time, also, you're burning up all the while your own wrong thinking and impurities. And spiritual practices, I would just throw into the mix, which work perfectly with service. They'll feed you, because I've met many people who engage in a life of service. I had one instructor who said to me, look, I've lost the will, the motivation. The spiritual practices will give you that motivation, and if you do them correctly, and that is a big if, but there are certain practices that, if it was done correctly, you could go through 1,000 years of experience. That sounds ridiculous in a way, but it could make what it means is you have learned so much internally that 1,000 years of experiences that otherwise you'd have had to go through to learn all those things, you won't need. And this is why service is a greater path than any others. The old paths, which were focused on meditation, retreat, and so on, must have entailed some degree of suppression. As a matter of fact, suppression was encouraged in them, and detachment was encouraged in them. And so they would detach from certain lower centers without transmuting it, just so they could raise the Kundalini to a higher center. I've done that in a limited way myself. I have raised the Kundalini to the higher centers, but in the process, I realize now that I was able to detach. Maybe that's something I'd learned before, or maybe I just did it instinctively, but I didn't transmute, as Dr. King did, all the energies in the lower centers, take them all that energy upwards, which cause a full rise of Kundalini and total complete enlightenment and total samadhi. As a matter of fact, I think he entered the highest degree of cosmic consciousness. I think he could have ascended, but didn't and chose not to, because I don't think he even needed to be here anyway. Yeah. But that's him. But those people, though, on that old path, they would have to, in my opinion, reincarnate again to learn the lessons from those experiences that they blocked off. So they could have, who knows how many lives. They might have attained a degree of samadhi in retreat, but have to come back and go through lessons. We hear about this in the autobiography of a yogi by Yogananda, of a great person by the name of Lahiri Mahasaya, who had lives before that in retreat, but had to come back as a householder to learn certain lessons. Now, he learnt them very quickly with the help of the greatest master anyone could possibly have, namely the Lord Babaji. But, he was an exceptional individual, right at the top of his evolutionary tree, I would say. I don't know whether he ascended in that life or not. I don't know, but he was very, very advanced. But it would depend on the person. So, long story short, if you engage in service, though, and you don't go into that meditative path, and service is the way anyway, especially now, then you will gradually be transmuting and learning, even if it's learning through understanding the problems of others. Yes. That's one of the keys given in the second freedom, actually, by Mars Sector 6. He says here, let me get it here. Become enlightened, gain understanding of the feelings and problems of all peoples, and love becomes a living, vibrant, all-pervasive thing. And that you're doing this when you serve others. Yeah. And so love then becomes a living, vibrant, all-pervasive thing, which means that the heart chakra opens, which means that you're also evolving as well. And you must do so. So, long story short, you could, through service, be further away from a degree of samadhi than some of those who took the meditative path, but closer to ascension. Because you may not have to come back to learn the certain lessons that other person would have to learn.
I think, as you've highlighted there, service is sort of like the most meaningful activity that we could be doing.
It is.
Which would bring that life.
And I think people know that. I mean, they know the difference between, say, doing something for yourself, whatever it might be, and then doing something for others. And the satisfaction that brings, it's a simple thing. And when you know you've really accomplished something, I mean, I know you've experienced this when you've given a particular talk or something, you feel that deep inner sense of accomplishment, which brings great joy with it, and it's lasting. You don't bathe in it, you don't stop and think, okay, that's me then, I've done that now. So you move on and you leave it, but it's still there though. And that's the difference between laughter of the mind, the happiness, you've had your fun, you've had your experience that you thought would bring you happiness, and it did, but it's gone, it's over, it's not still with you, but joy is lasting. Yeah,
no, I think again it gives real clarity for people. And I think one person who's a great example of well, you mentioned, you kind of hinted at earlier, who was actually assassinated for his achievements in helping others, and who had devoted his life in such a way as Martin Luther King. If I had to summarize his legacy, in terms of what he was like as a person, I would say that was a person of real moral courage, moral clarity, someone who's committed to a sense of justice and for doing what's right. And you can imagine, what kind of sense of me, what reservoir lasting inner joy that might give you, in terms of the impact and the difference you're making to other people's lives. I mean, I think people will know, but his achievements in the area of civil rights are renowned. He won the Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prize, for his work there. It resulted in many laws that were introduced in the US as a result of his peaceful demonstrations, and people know his I Have a Dream speech and whatnot. And I think, there's a real example there of someone whose commitment to building a better world, whose achievements, whose devotion to service will have created for him a real lasting satisfaction in the sort of seeing the result and the change that he was able to bring about. And it comes back to that message of service, something that we can all experience by going within. And I think the promise that you've shared of what service can bring to each one of us as well within us is also an awesome...
He was assassinated, wasn't he?
He was, yeah.
Yeah, which you said there are forces that don't want that, and you're up against them, and I think some of us experience what it's like to be up against those kind of forces, and they will try and stop you, but that means you're onto something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think his words speak to that. I mean, he said, the surest way to be happy is to seek happiness for others. I mean, it's,
simple and true, totally karmic.
Yeah.
It really works.
You can see where his motivating force came from. I think that really reveals it. If this is the way he thinks, I mean, his whole life was oriented in that way. Mm-hmm. Meaningful long-term goals, deeper lasting satisfaction, all oriented around service to others. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much, Richard.
Oh, thank you, Darren.
I think there's lots of things that we can take away there and ruminate in the week ahead. One is this difference between the fleeting laughter of the mind and the rich, lasting laughter of the soul, which is joy. One is a temporary thing, perhaps something fun or exhilarating, and one is steeped in a life of meaningful accomplishment. Most of all, service to others, just like the example of Martin Luther King Jr. and his very, very simple words that he used to explain it. One is here today and gone tomorrow, and one is a deep, lasting reservoir of joy and even peace that you can come back to again and again. And even during periods when you may feel unhappy, still this lasting joy can be ever present in your life. And if you keep going with that life of meaningful accomplishment, especially a life of service to others, that joy continues to grow, and you enjoy a deeper sense of profound peace and even one day the bliss of enlightenment. Now, if you enjoyed that episode about joy, be sure to check out this video over here about making a connection with a real spiritual master, or this one over here about being in the world but not a slave of it. If you can't see the links on the screen, be sure to check out the description. I'll leave them in there. But thanks very much for tuning into the show, and see you next time.